And as a believer, whenever you die, you're going to have, it's not just dying grace, okay? You're going to have that escort. Okay, it's just a lot more magnificent when you think about it from the perspective of proper function and dying grace. Okay, but you will have an escort even if you die in reversionism. The idea is that when we saw the Lazarus and the rich man was not a believer. We know that because he went to torments instead of going into Abraham's bosom. Okay, so he was not a believer, and that's why he was not escorted by angels, whereas Lazarus was escorted by angels. But we also know that Lazarus was a properly functioning believer. But I don't want you to leave. I apologize if I made it sound like as a malfunctioning believer you wouldn't get the escort either, but you do, because we are all ambassadors, and we're all priests, and whether we're good priests or bad priests, good ambassadors or bad ambassadors, we still have certain privileges, and that's still one of the privileges. Okay, and the difference will be that you as a properly functioning believer will have dying grace, and it'll be a wonderful experience, versus someone else who is in reversionism and has the sin unto death. Okay, they'll have maximum punishment until time that they die, and then once they die, of course, there's no more punishment. Okay, and so they get the escort, because at that point physical death has ceased their physical function, and so they will still get the escort. But the idea that I wanted you to understand was that we have the opportunity of, as believers, of having this wonderful experience associated with being escorted back home. Okay, so I apologize that that got confusing and I was a little bit flippant. I did not mean to do that. So we are still in point 12, subpoint B, the Mount of Transfiguration, and I think we're ready with the last subpoint, which, because I skipped one intentionally, should be, it's in mine as 6, but it should be 5 for you guys, right? So we're in subpoint 5. The one I skipped, not to mention, you think, what did he tell us that he wrote? I did tell you what I wrote. I just didn't tell it to you as a point, and it was somewhat repetitive of something you already have. So you're not missing out on anything. Okay, so I would never allow you to miss out on something that is extremely important. Okay, so subpoint 5. On the way down the mountain, Jesus cautioned the disciples not to tell anyone what they had seen until, quote, the Son of Man, end quote, was raised from the dead. Other accounts tell us that the disciples were not sure of what he meant, by, quote, raised from the dead, end quote. Even though prior to the transfiguration, he had predicted his death. That's in Matthew 16:21. And of course, in Matthew 16:21, we have the Lord talking about himself, about his death. And then in Peter, in Matthew 16:22, the very next verse is where Peter is protesting about his death and saying, no, don't die, right? And the Lord has to tell him to be quiet, okay, that he's trying to teach lessons here. Okay, he tells him, get up, get in the back of the line. Anyway, the idea is that he'd been talking about his death and raising from his death, and they were supposed to understand from the various accounts of the Messiah and the information that came from the Old Testament, indications about the Messiah, that he was going to be in the ground for 3 days and then raised up, right? So you can see that they were a bit confused. And what's interesting is you have individuals that say, gee, I wish I lived back in that time period. Yeah, I'd be such a great believer. I'd be doing all of these things if I could only be with the Lord. And it's like you had people here that were right with the Lord, that were going to end up being apostles, and at that point, they were struggling and having a hard time. What makes you think that you would be so much better? We have so much more information with the completed canon than they had while they were right there. Okay, it made a lot more sense now that we have it, and we can actually go into it and dig through it and put it all together and see it. Okay, so we are tremendously more blessed that, at our point in time than they were at their point in time, because they were still somewhat confused. But anyway, he had told them not to do it until after he was raised from the dead. Continue the point. The revelation of the transfiguration was a prophetic revelation, and his resurrection from the dead would confirm what the transfiguration declared. You see, the transfiguration was a representation of what was to come, right? That's why he had the two heralds there with him. It was the idea of what was to come, not what was there already. So it was what was going to come. But first, he had to be crucified, and he had to die, and then he had to be resurrected. Okay, and so he had to, you had to have that happen before the actual account of of what the transfiguration was representing could actually happen. Okay, and of course that's going to happen. We're talking about the second advent. Okay, but it can't happen until after the resurrection, after the end of the first advent. Okay, so he's telling them not to come, and you're going to see here why he's telling them not to talk about it. Okay, they were privileged enough to see it. That was one of the things that was given to them as a privilege of being the type of disciples they were, functioning properly, getting the fact that they're going to have these messages understood, and they're going to have to be able to give messages as apostles going on. Right? Remember, these were three guys who were apostles: James, John, and Peter. Okay. And of course, John is the first one to die, and so he doesn't get to see a lot of the things that are going to happen. And anyway, so they were privileged to see this, but he told them, don't tell anybody. Okay, so here's why. Continue the point. If news of the transfiguration spread prematurely, it could have been misunderstood and lead to his followers trying to enthrone him before he actually died and paid for their sins. You see, that possibility is very, very, very well presented when you have Peter, who's ready to, at a drop of a hat, to say, okay, let's get on with it. You don't need to die. I believe that's going to happen to you. Let's just go on, right? He wanted to build the tabernacles. He wanted to, he wanted Christ to not have to die. He wanted, he just wanted to, to have Christ there and be worshipped at that point in time. And Christ had to stop him and say, no, I've got to do this. Okay, this is what has been prophesied. This is what must happen. I have to not only be the individual that is qualified to do this work, but I actually have to do the work. I have to die and pay for the sins of the world. If I don't do that, then all of this is nothing. Right? So quit trying to get the cart before the horse, right? Get back and let me function, okay? And so he didn't want these guys to come down the mountain and say what they saw, because that kind of an attitude could have then spread, right? And then you would have had the situation where it would have led to the potential of Christ never even being crucified. He had to be crucified. Okay, he had to hang on the cross. He had to pass the level of sin, or excuse me, the level of temptation and everything that Adam had undergone. He had to become the second Adam, past that and not sin. Okay, he had to pay then for the sins of the world. All of that had to occur. And it could not have occurred if this message had gotten out. This was a privileged message to these individuals so that they could see. Because remember, before that, he tells them, and people miss this, okay, because unfortunately of the chapter break in the Bible. But what happens is there's the passage in the Bible when he says, several of you will not die until you see the kingdom of heaven first, right? And people read that and they go, well, everyone that's there died. They're all dead. I don't see any of those people from from that time period living. Okay, they'd have been in the Guinness Book of World Records. I know it. Okay, and they're so that's a lie. See, that's one of the lies in the Bible. Well, no, it's not, because right after that is the Mount of Transfiguration, and 3 of those individuals get to see it. Okay, but unfortunately, because of the way the break is in the English translation of the Bible, people don't make that connection. They don't normally see that one verse is followed by the other account. Okay, that's the account that they're talking about. So these individuals got to see it. God, the Lord kept his word. He showed these individuals this, but it was for them only, so that they could see. You talk about motivation. They were going to undergo some tough times as apostles. In the case of John, for example, to be martyred. Okay, and we understand that James was potentially martyred as well. Okay, there's several historical accounts that kind of go back and forth, but one of the accounts says that he was martyred as well, right? Paul and everybody else, but those 3 were going to undergo some pretty tough times, right? And so here they got a little bit of a motivation. This is what you're working for. this is what's going to happen, and this is what's important. But they were not allowed to tell anybody. Okay, so anyway. Elijah was there. That's our point in this story. Okay, that's our point in this thing. Subpoint C. This is the last subpoint in point 12. Subpoint C. Then, of course, we should understand as well that Moses and Elijah were with the Lord as an indication that they will be the heralds of the second advent. It's important for us to understand this. There is some doctrines going around. Okay, again, you got to be careful when you go out on the internet if you're doing your worshiping on the internet. Okay, one of the things you got to be careful is there are doctrines going around that's saying just like there were just like John the Baptizer was not Elijah reincarnated. Okay, it was a representation of Elijah, and the same things Elijah did in the Old Testament, John the Baptizer was doing in the New Testament. These 2 heralds are not really Moses and Elijah. Okay, they're only going to be Moses-like and Elijah-like. Okay, it's not really those 2. It's indications of heralds that are like those 2. Okay, and that Moses has died and he's really dead and he's never going to come back. Okay, and Elijah was taken up, and you got to be careful there because some people do think that he was taken up and placed someplace else where nobody ever knew who he was, and he died in obscurity. Okay, but there's those that believe that it's not Moses and Elijah, but it is Moses and Elijah, because when you compare Scripture to Scripture, you see that it's tied very well together, and these 2 individuals are going to be the heralds. Okay, so Moses and Elijah were with the Lord as an indication that they will be the heralds of the second advent. Continue the point. The first advent had 1 herald, John the Baptizer. And the second advent will have 2. Once again, to see this, we go back to the book of Malachi. And see, when people read this, you just wonder how they try and make things so difficult. But anyway, we go back to the book of Malachi. In Malachi 4, 4 and 5, we see this, comma, quote. And again, if you have a translation that doesn't have Malachi 4 in it, you'll just have to look for this because I don't remember what it was. It's chapter 3, verse 38 or something like that. Malachi 4, 4 and 5, I have this, comma, quote. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, comma. I made that sound like a question, didn't mean to. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, comma. Even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb, Horeb, for all Israel, period. Verse 5, quote, behold, I'm going to send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, period, end quote. Here, as in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Thessalonians 2:2, the phrase, quote, day of the Lord, end quote, refers to the second advent. If you want more information, by the way, we do have a category on day, okay, that we've studied in the past, Hemera in the Greek, okay, and we have Day of the Lord, we have the Lord's Day, we have very quite a few terms associated with day. And Day of the Lord here refers to the second advent. We also get that from the fact that it talks about the coming of the great and terrible day. Remember, the second advent, okay, is when we have the beginning of the wars, okay, when the Lord is going to come down and take care of everything, okay? So the idea is that the first advent is not a great and terrible day. The first advent is wonderful. The first advent is the Messiah coming to actually execute the salvation promise. Okay, it's the day of the Lord, the second advent, where we're going to come down, okay, and we're going to be able to have the opportunity to help grab demons and shove their little rear ends in torments, or shove the rear ends into Hades, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we have the day of the Lord, and that refers to the second advent. Okay, continue the point. In Revelation 11:3, we see that there are two witnesses who will precede or usher in the Lord at the second advent. Therefore, we can conclude that they are Moses and Elijah, as given to us in Malachi, and the account of the Mount of Transfiguration. Period. There's no coincidence that Moses and Elijah are both, okay, given to us in the Malachi verse. Okay, and then we see them again in the Mount of Transfiguration. Why would we then turn around and say, oh, gee, we don't know who those two witnesses are for the second advent? It must be Moses-like and Elijah-like, but it's not really them. No, it's really them. Okay, they are going to be there. And that's why there was never any account of Moses' body. And of course, Elijah, he just gets taken away. So the idea is they are going to be resuscitated, and they will be there at the second advent. Okay. And remember, we got to see that they will also be coming with all kinds of special powers. One of the neat ones is that they're going to have flamethrowers, so they can shoot flames right out of their mouths, okay, at individuals that are trying to harm them. Okay, that would be kind of cool, I think. I pray for that all the time. I never get it. The worst kind of flames that can come out of my mouth is sarcasm. That's about it. And that doesn't really kill anybody. But anyway, they're going to have that. Point 13, summary. Subpoint A. Elijah was a mature believer and prophet to Israel, whose job was to teach and remind both the people and their leadership concerning proper function. So his job was to continue to remind the king, even though the king wanted him dead every instant of his life, his job was to remind the king of what his responsibility as a king was, okay, to make sure that his nation was functioning properly. And of course, to also, he had Elijah had the responsibility also of trying to teach the people and remind the people. That's why we had the situation with the priest of Baal, right? It was a great and wonderful demonstration, and the people repented for a while, okay? Subpoint B. As a mature believer, it's terminology we would use in this dispensation, but as a mature believer, he showed courage, manners, and poise. Subpoint C. Although he was a great believer, he also had an old sin nature which led him to malfunction. See, and the lesson there for us is to remember that we are to be considered slaves of Christ, right? Christ may consider us to be his friend. We get that because a slave does not know what his master is doing concept. So we can be considered by Christ to be friends of Christ, but we never consider ourselves to be that, because that leads to that kind of an arrogance. We can get in doctrine, we can function properly, and while those around us may not be functioning properly, we're not to lord it over them. We're not to say, gee, we're so much smarter than you are, we've got so much more doctrine. We're supposed to function properly. And and what we're learning in James, by our actions then, we manifest that. Okay, and then those around us get the opportunity to say, wow, that person is different. Why is that person different? And then you get the opportunity to be an ambassador, right? But you don't get that opportunity if you're lording it over them in arrogance, or in arrogance if you go into fear like Elijah did here. So the idea is, no matter how great you are, and can be measured on the maturity and greatness scale in God's list of, God's scale. Okay, you are never to consider yourself on that scale, where you are on that scale. You're supposed to just do your job, and not get out of fellowship because of arrogance. See, that was the problem that Elijah had. He considered himself to be really good, and he was disappointed when Jezebel didn't cower and turn over to God because of him and what he had done, right? And instead he got out of fellowship, and then when she threatened him, he got afraid. And what did he do? He went into self-pity, right? Went underneath a tree. Oh, poor pitiful me. Take me now. There's nothing left for me to do. You have no idea what's left for you to do. God has the idea of what's left for you to do. So you just do it. Function moment by moment, and you let God worry about whether this is the last moment or 140 years from now is your last moment. I'm taking into account that science is somehow going to figure out how to counteract some of these stupid things that they're trying to counteract. So, I'll give you the opportunity of maybe another 140 years. But the idea is you do what you're supposed to do, and you don't get arrogant. And that's what happened to Elijah. He was human. He had an old sin nature, and part of his old sin nature apparently was arrogance, like it is in all of ours. Okay, and he led him to malfunction, and he malfunctioned. He let his volition go the way that the old sin nature was vibrating. Subpoint D, and this is the but part of it. Subpoint D, he didn't stay in malfunction and go into reversionism. However, instead, he got back into God's plan and was rewarded with dying grace. Subpoint E, he mentored Elisha, excuse me. Thank you. He mentored Elisha, who became a great believer and prophet as well. In addition, he led several schools of prophets, period. See, so he was given the opportunity to influence individuals directly because of the leadership role that he was put in. But you, as a properly functioning believer, you influence people all the time that you may or may not even know of. It doesn't matter whether you're in that leadership position or not. The lesson that you should take from this is that, again, you do your job and function properly. And just by the way you act, the way you speak, the things you do, they influence those around you into a level that you may not even know. I know from a personal experience the reason that I ended up being saved and getting into this kind of information was as a result of an individual that I worked with. It was at school at the time, but I was working with him at school, and just his manifestation, the way he behaved, okay, gave me the question to start asking him questions. And that's when I found out that even as a Catholic and going to catechism and church all the time, I was never satisfied. That's why I left the church. I knew that I was not learning anything, that I wasn't getting anything, but I didn't understand that I wasn't a believer. I didn't even understand what a believer was, right? Until I spent quite a bit of time with this individual. We actually had in school, in high school, we had kind of taken the science classes that they had, and so we ended up wanting to have a little bit more science, and so we ended up getting the opportunity to do independent study of science, and so it was the two of us who were taking advanced chemistry, and we ended up spending a lot of time together working in advanced chemistry because it was just the two of us, and then occasionally meeting with the professor or teacher, wasn't a doctor or anything, but the teacher to go over over the results of the experiments and blah blah blah. Anyway, we got to spend quite a bit of time together, and I got to know the individual better. Okay, and he gave me the gospel. Okay, in a way that finally made sense, and I understood it. Okay, was saved. Now, I'd been around believers before, and I'd been getting that indication and kind of knew something, right? But that opportunity to spend time with him, and he wasn't the only example. I had other people that I was going to school with who were believers, who were functioning properly, and I would go, gee, how come that person's different? And so I'd gotten information from them. Okay, but it was in the quiet time or whatever that I got it from him, and that turned out he was Baptist, and I ended up going to the Baptist church and didn't learn anything there either after I got the gospel. But the idea was that it was through things that he saw that led me to ask him directly some of these questions. Well, it could be the same to you, and it may not even be you. You may be the individual who starts it, who lights the fire because of what you're doing. The individual starts questioning, right? And then maybe they run into someone else who then is the one who gives them the opportunity to give them the gospel. So it might be you, it may not be you. But the idea is it doesn't matter. You function properly, and you are going to influence individuals whether you realize it or not. Okay? And then subpoint F. He was an example of a believer who used doctrine to the maximum to live in God's plan. He showed that malfunction doesn't have to be the end of proper function. See, that's the problem with human nature. For some reason, we think that failure is permanent, right? Failure doesn't have to be permanent. That's what motivational teachers will tell you, right? Well, in that case, they're right. Motivation, failure doesn't have to be permanent. But you look at what happens with people when they're on a diet, right? They get on a diet and they make one mistake and they eat something they shouldn't eat, and what happens? They fail the diet. They fall off the wagon, right? And then diets don't work, and they never get back on again, and they turn into blimps. Or the worst part, they can try diet over and over and over and over again, and every diet they have malfunction at some point in that diet, and they say, this one doesn't work, I'm going to go on another diet, right? The idea is, with respect to that, is you're supposed to make a lifestyle change and learn to eat better, okay, so that you can be successful. But the idea in God's plan is malfunction isn't the end either. Just because you malfunction doesn't mean you fall out of God's plan, and now all of a sudden you're going to have to be there until sin unto death, and you go directly into reversionism, and that's it. No, we were given the opportunity to have rebound, to get back in, to continue to function properly. Why? Because God knew that we would make dumb decisions. God knew that we would fall, so he provided the opportunity to get back in. And that's what Elijah demonstrates. He got back in, okay, and he ended up with dying grace. So last sentence, you can get back into proper function and lead a life that will end with dying grace. Subpoint G. It is because of his function, his courage, his, quote, rebound, end quote, and his success that he continues to be used as an example and specific to our study, is used as an example in James. As an example in James, or you could say in the book of James. Ta-da, end of category. so we made it. Okay. Actually, you have about 6 minutes left over. So you're going to get out a little bit, but I took some of those minutes during the break, obviously, for our prayer. And so we're going to go ahead and not try and fill those 6 minutes, although I just probably filled about a minute and a half of it with my yammering. But and we're going to go ahead now and end with a song. So if you'll stand. And obviously next week,